You often hear in discussions about near-death experiences that people hit a boundary, a boundary which is, do I go back, keep going, what have you? And people often describe that as where they make the decision to come back to Earth. And I think I may have been able to glimpse beyond that boundary a bit in this core realm. And I went there several times during this journey. But in the core, to me, it was an infinite inky blackness filled to overflowing with that divine, unconditional love of that creative God force that I also came to recognize in the core was the very source of all of our conscious awareness. That force of pure love is the generator at the core level of the universe of all of our conscious awareness. It is the source of consciousness, that love, that God force.
Hello, I'm Donald Lee, and this is Expressing and Revealing Your Truth with Donald Lee. It's a podcast in which I help you understand the truth about who you really are and how you can express and reveal that truth in the world. To do that, I interview people who have had transformational spiritual experiences, the type of experiences that many of us wish we had but never do. Yet by learning from my guests' experiences and the wisdom they gain from those experiences, all of us can glimpse a bigger vision of who we really are and how we can live our lives more fully, more peacefully, more lovingly. My guest on this episode is Dr. Eben Alexander. I call him an NDE Rock Star. It's kind of ironic. We sometimes say, it ain't brain surgery. Well, Dr. Alexander was a brain surgeon and a highly respected one. He suffered a brain infection, went into a coma, became brain dead, and his family was just about to pull the plug on his life support. Then he suddenly woke up from his coma and told about his incredible experience on the other side of the veil. But this experience just didn't fit with his former agnostic scientific worldview. It forced him to re-examine his beliefs, to search for answers about this other reality, and to take a whole new direction in his life. He wrote the New York Times best-selling book, Proof of Heaven, and now he dedicates his life to learning about and teaching about a broader understanding of reality that includes not just material reality, but also spiritual reality. I think you'll really enjoy this great interview with Dr. Eben Alexander. Here's the interview. Well, here we are with Dr. Eben Alexander. Now, Dr. Alexander is really a rock star in the world of near-death experiences. Not everybody who dies, so to speak, has what we call a near-death experience. And amongst those who do, it's often rather short, and they have an experience of maybe going down a tunnel or a hallway or something, and there's a white light, and they see some people they recognize, and it's beautiful and full of love and flowers and all this great stuff, and then they're kind of sucked back into their bodies. But Dr. Alexander had an incredible experience, and I know you're going to want to hear this. So let's jump in, and Eben, tell us your story.
Well, Don, thanks so much for having me on today. It's great to be here with you. Yeah, I have to share a little bit about who I was before when all this happened in 2008, 54 years old. I'd been worked more than 15 years teaching neurosurgery at Harvard Medical School, thought I had some understanding of brain-mind consciousness, but I was in for a wild ride to show me that my knowledge was just beginning to glimpse of reality. I'll point out that my adoptive father, this is an important part of my story, I was adopted, and my birth mother was 16, unwed, and I was very fortunate to be adopted into a wonderful, loving family, and it just so happened that adoption parent, my father, was globally renowned neurosurgeon. So that influenced me greatly in growing up towards science and always knowing science is the pathway to truth. But I'll also put out there that my father had very strong belief in God and the power of prayer. And he knew all about Big Bang cosmology and modern physics, etc. But for him, he had grown up His own father was a general surgeon in Eastern Tennessee. He used to take him to the Presbyterian Church every Sunday of his life. So for my father, who spent more than 2 years in the Pacific Theater during World War II as a combat surgeon, well, I still have at my bedside the little pocket Bible, New Testament and Psalms that he had when he was in the Pacific Theater. And I think it's one of the reasons he came back quite intact and doing well and ran a neurosurgical program and all that, because he had this big, strong belief in God. Now, like many who grew up in the 60s and 70s, like I did, I always knew science is the pathway to truth. I didn't really care so much about whatever fables I might have been told in my church confirmation class. And yet there was a deep amount of truth there that took me, half century to come to recognize. Anyway, getting back into my story here. So that's kind of who I was before, very scientific. But when I say that, many people make the mistake of thinking science in the modern era is Newtonian determinism, but it's not. Modern science is quantum physics, and quantum physics is more proven than anything we've ever studied in the scientific world before. And yet it also has some deep kind of non-intuitive features and mysteries buried deep that are hints to us about the nature of reality and the primacy of consciousness. We can get into all that much later, but in my NDE, the important thing is that I was driven into coma very quickly. November 10th, 2008. I just last week finished my 17th anniversary since that week in coma.
Congratulations.
Well, to me, it's always a week filled with prayer and gratitude, for every blessing that's come my way and everything that's happened since my coma. Every breath has been blessing. For me, gratitude is right at the core of everything that I live these days. So anyway, what did I experience? Important to also point out that one atypical feature of my near-death experience was that I was amnesic. I had no memories of Eben Alexander's life, no knowledge of humans, Earth. It was totally empty slate. Now, when I first came back to this world and I was trying to explain all that, my neuroscience knowledge took 2 months to come back. So it wasn't fully present. And all I knew was the incredible richness of the journey I had just been through. But as I was climbing out of all this and talking over with doctors and trying to make sense of it, they would pat me on the back and say, well, your brain was soaking in pus. We have no idea how you're even coming back to us, but you can forget about it because a dying brain plays all kinds of tricks. So I believed my doctors. Said, okay, the dying brain, wow, what a hallucination that was. But I did not yet know the medical details. And when I started getting to them, going back to review my records, scans, neurologic exams, Glasgow coma scales, all that, I realized, wait a minute, this story is not lining up at all. This brain is in no shape to harbor any kind of dream or hallucination, much less this extraordinary ultra reality I experienced. So I had a deep mystery plopped right in my lap, especially in the weeks afterward. So my original thinking was, well, maybe the memories disappeared. I harbored my old materialist thought that it's not true that memories are stored in the brain. But I was still thinking maybe they are. And so to me, to have all the memories disappear from my NDE made some degree of sense, but then they're all coming back to me. And that part was another mystery. Anyway, but getting into it, so in amnesia, don't worry, people. This is probably not going to happen to you if you have an NDE, that you'll be completely amnesic. A lot of people do worry about that. They think, oh my God, I don't want to have anything like that happen. I can tell you, in my case, it was a gift, because it was the best way to really come to the deep understanding of all the features I needed to get out of this journey. And now we'll take off into the story itself. So in that amnesic state, it all started in what I call the earthworm's eye view, very primitive course, kind of unresponsive realm, like being in dirty jello. And people would often ask me when I gave early talks about all this, was that hell or purgatory, that earthworm eye view? I'd say, I think it was the best consciousness my brain could muster soaking in pus. But that, of course, misses the fact that there's a much richer story about to unfold. Because what I remember happening is, out of these murky mists of that earthworm eye view came this slowly spinning white white light melody that had fine silvery and golden tendrils around it, and it was slowly rotating, but it came with a perfect musical melody. And the music is important because anybody who's followed my work since then will recognize I do a major form of sound-enhanced meditation. It's called sacredacoustics.com is the website for anybody. It's called binaural beat brainwave entrainment. We can talk about all that later. Music is right at the core of it all, vibration and frequency. So that becomes a gigantic theme in this whole kind of adventure of discovery. For me, that light portal opened up into this rich, ultra-real Gateway Valley. The Gateway Valley was in many ways like Plato's world of ideals, but for the individual soul. And so it was beautiful beyond description. And yet this is the realm where we would reconnect with souls of departed loved ones, go through life reviews, which we can talk about later. They're a very important kind of consequence of all this. The life review is a reliving of events of your life from the perspective of all involved. I mean, it's much more than just a memory of events. And that's the important thing we can discuss later. At any rate, in this beautiful Gateway Valley, I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. I never had any body awareness whatsoever. There were millions of other butterflies looping and spiraling in these vast formations in colors beyond the rainbow, just immense kind of beauty and awe. And below us in this meadow, this lovely, perfect meadow, all these souls dancing, lots of joy and merriment, children playing, dogs jumping. I mean, to me, it was incredible festivity. It was all being driven because up above were these swooping orbs of pure angelic beings that were emanating chants and anthems, hymns that would just thunder through my awareness with this incredible sense of awe and majesty, but also a reminder of spiritual home. You know, I need to remind people that I use these words and tell the story, and for a lot of people, they go, that sounds a little exotic and out there. But for a tremendous number of people who've had similar experiences, they go, oh my God, I remember. And so many people reached out to me after they read Proof of Heaven and said it reminded them something deep in their psyche that they'd forgotten for some reason. But now it was coming true, and it suggested they'd been on similar journeys. And that's the kind of resonance of it all. That's a very important feature because we've all been through this kind of journey before and we'll go back again. So at any rate, on this butterfly wing, where I have no body awareness at all, but I'm simply observing all that's going on around me, one of the best parts about it was I wasn't alone. There's a beautiful young woman there, sparkling blue eyes, high forehead, high cheekbones, broad smile. She never said a word. She never had to. Her mind melded with mine in this beautiful emotional, cognitive information transfer. And her message to me, as I put it into words many weeks later and writing it all down, her message was, you are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You're richly cared for. You can do no wrong. Now, I wish I'd explained that last phrase much more fully in the book Proof of Heaven. I thought people got that here we are in this incredible realm of light and love, and this is where you might go through your life review. But anything that you've done that's handing out pain and suffering to others, being greedy, selfish, what have you, will look especially bad in the beautiful light and love of that realm. And so what I was trying to convey is when I said you can do no wrong, it simply means if we follow the most natural, organic pathway forward of love, light, compassion, mercy, acceptance, forgiveness, then we have a very straightforward path and we can, quote, do no wrong. But we have the free will as a gift of that loving God for us to do otherwise. So we can choose alternate pathways, but they're really asking, for trouble. That's why the life review is kind of like the golden rule written in the fabric of the universe. Treat others as you would like to be treated. At any rate, so in this beautiful Gateway Valley, I have this lovely woman beside me who's a spiritual guide. And then I realized that all of four-dimensional space-time, which is something you can vaguely perceive from the spiritual realm, all of that collapses down. And then all of the spiritual realm, and I must stress that that realm is not at all stuck in Earth time. It's one of the important things to get and understand what's going on in these journeys, to recognize that they happen in a realm of eternity, which is really where our souls live too. And so that's why this kind of grander sense of the life review as a reliving of events from everybody's perspective starts to make more sense. The universe has that kind of power to show us the events and also give us opportunities to kind of shift our emotional energy around those events. At any rate, for me, the way that unfolded was all of that realm collapsed down too. And I ascended through a light portal, again associated with music, this time the music of those angelic choirs above, emanating those hymns. And that's where I entered into the core realm. You often hear in discussions about near death experiences that people hit a boundary, a boundary which is, do I go back, keep going, what have you? And people often describe that as where they make the decision to come back to Earth. And I think I may have been able to glimpse beyond that boundary a bit in this core realm. And I went there several times during this journey. But in the core, to me, it was an infinite inky blackness filled to overflowing with that divine, unconditional love of that creative God force that I also came to recognize in the core was the very source of all of our conscious awareness. That force of pure love is the generator at the core level of the universe of all of our conscious awareness. It is the source of consciousness, that love, that God force. And all of us use our brains as basically a dissociation device to pull off a little eddy current of that primordial mind. And that's what we use. But we think it's separate. We think our mind is ours alone, period. And yet there's plenty of evidence from parapsychology of the reality of things like telepathy. Guillaume Playfair, in his book on twin telepathy, says 35% of identical twins have powerful telepathic experiences. Now, once you would just acknowledge that telepathy is a very real phenomenon, and the reason it happens so easily in twins is because they have an identical genetic makeup that gives them a very close to identical nervous system makeup. So their nervous systems have great resonance and can serve as transceivers to allow them to feel this information at a distance. It's not an electromagnetic signal because it does not diminish as inverse square law does, which is true for all electromagnetism. This is more of an entanglement field, which is not diminished through time or space. The entanglement field, of course, was the source of the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2022. And as we discover more about how it links directly with our mental field of awareness, then we'll start to understand much more about consciousness, the nature of time, etc. Anyway, back to my little journey. Um, One important thing to mention is because of my amnesia, I could not have an Eben Alexander life review, but I saw life reviews in the core realm in two very powerful ways. The first one I call the flying fish vision, and I won't go into that because it's not as powerful and complex and meaningful as the one that I encountered later. During a later passage through the core, I had what I call the Indra's net vision. And it was this beautiful vision of multiple interwoven threads, fibers making up this fabric. And the weave was actually our incarnation between lives, this kind of web and weave of our soul journey, because you can't get all of the knowledge acquisition done in one lifetime. That's the reason we have to come back to kind of work towards that oneness with the divine over multiple lifetimes. But it's still all about love, compassion, and kindness, and acknowledgement that we're all in this together. So in this Indra's net vision, that was all crystal clear to me, but also very importantly, this is not a vision of reincarnation like in Buddhism, where it's all get off the wheel of suffering, to nirvana. But in fact, it acknowledges that we learn and teach and grow and transform all of consciousness, this universal consciousness, through our living of these lives as sentient beings temporarily in these bodies. So in other words, we're spiritual beings having a spiritual experience, but a lot of that work is actually done when we're kind of temporarily blinded, when we have gone through program forgetting as a child. So any past life memories or between life memories get covered over by the age of 6 or 7. And for whatever reason, that's our current situation for humanity, at least in our culture, is those life reviews
If
where
I
you
could
talk about reincarnation.
just kind of comment on that for a moment. No, that's one of the lines, and I don't remember exactly where I read it now, but when you're in such a realm of incredible love, you're just naturally caught up in love.
Right,
But
exactly.
so it's easy in a sense, right?
It is
But
very easy, and
here
it's
on
also familiar. It's
here on
familiar.
earth, in this material realm, we
Uh,
really have to work at love because it's a realm in which love is very much absent. And so we learn to seek love because we experience the absence of love. And that's
Absolutely.
perhaps one of the greatest lessons that we can learn in this material world
Right.
that's much harder to learn when you're just swimming in a sea of love. You don't know anything else.
That's
It kinda ties in with the whole we have duality in this material world so that we can make choices.
right. Well, very important point. I'm glad you made all that. And I'll also point out that love in this world is often kind of conditional. If you do this, I'll love you. And of course, most of us would like to think that our love between like parent and child is a little more pure than that. But there's so many baby wounds out there and kind of people living down, negative lessons they got in their early lifetime. But unconditional love has tremendous power, and loving your enemies has tremendous power, and praying for your enemies being in quotes here because I don't think any of us really have enemies, but we have more challenging sentient beings out there that are helping us to grow into specifically more difficult lessons. That's why we perceive them as difficult. But anyway, I've opened my mind much more to my interactions with others and how often somebody I might have before my coma seen as an enemy or my nemesis, I now see as a very important ally, even though we still have significant headbutting going on. Kind of reminds me of that old saying from Confucius, if you find something objectionable in another, look inside yourself, which I think says a lot about how we're sharing the dream of the one mind to help us all learn and grow into this. Anyway, I'll get back into my NDE just to kind of finish it off quickly, and then we can go wherever you want to go with this. Anyway, I've cycled through multiple levels, multiple times of what I've described. The earthworm eye view, the gateway valley, the core, and every kind of configuration around them. And then finally, every time I entered the core, I was told, you're not here to stay, you'll be going back. But we'll teach you many things. So that all sounded fine enough. And especially since I'd already been through multiple trips where I went back to the earth from my view, and by conjuring up the musical notes melody in my mind, that's how I could bring that light portal back in and conjure these up. So it's always through kind of memories of music and vibration, even though I know your audience will appreciate that sound in that realm can be far more beautiful and etheric than sound in this world, because in this world, it's very limited by the physics of four-dimensional space-time. In that world, it's a world of ideals. So at any rate, there came a time when I could no longer conjure up the light portals to take me back into the Gateway Valley. To say I was sad would be an understatement, but I also knew I could trust I would be taken care of. And that's when I witnessed thousands of beings going off around me into the distance, heads bowed, many holding candles, and they were murmuring this energy was coming to me, and it was very comforting. So now I'm back in the earth for my view, but I'm getting the same kind of comfort and sense of spiritual home and welcome that I'd gotten in the higher levels, the Gateway Valley and the core during early passages. But now here it is coming from all these beings around me. And I called that in my writings weeks later. I said that was the power of prayer. And it was kind of guiding me back to this world. And then the last thing I saw in my near death experience were six faces. They would bubble up out of the muck. They'd say a few words that I couldn't understand because of my amnesia. Then they'd disappear into the muck again. Now, I can remember those faces as clearly today as if the whole thing just happened yesterday. And yet it happened 17 years ago. But the interesting thing about those faces is they were close family and friends who were present in the ICU room the last 24 to 48 hours of coma. Very importantly, many people who had been there earlier in the week, I had no memory of. So what this helped to do, they served as what are called veridical time anchors, because they marked events that were happening on Earth, because those were people actually kind of trying to intervene with me in my coma, opening my eyes and talking to me. And then also, it turns out one of them was not physically present. Her name is Susan Renches. I had first met her in 1972 when we were freshmen together in English class at UNC Chapel Hill. Lost touch with her. Then she worked with my former spouse. They both taught together at Ravenscroft School in Raleigh. Then we lost touch again. But my former spouse knew that Susan had done work in channeling to coma patients. In fact, she wrote a book called Third Eye Open. And in that book, she describes her efforts. So my family contacted Susan and asked her to channel to me on the fourth and fifth nights of my coma. And she did that from her home in Chapel Hill, about 120 miles from where I was hospitalized in Lynchburg, Virginia. And she was there as much as anybody else. The ones I sensed that night who were physically present those 2 nights, in the ICU room. Well, Susan was right there with them. So she was as real to me as anybody who was physically present. And in fact, when that was all explained to me in the days after awakening, when I said, well, you were there and you were there, but where was Susan? And they said, well, Susan was never physically here, but she channeled to you those 2 nights. Of course, before my coma, as a materialist neurosurgeon, I would have scoffed at you for using the word channeling as if there was anything to it. But now I knew the deep truth of it. Of course, she was there without any limitation of space and time. So, yes, Susan, thanks for helping me come back to this world. At any rate, it was the last face I saw that actually got me to come back. It was a 10-year-old boy. I didn't recognize him at the time. Turns out this is Sunday morning on Earth, day 7 of coma. The doctors just held a family conference. They told my family I'd gone from 10% chance of survival down to 2% over that week, but now with no chance of recovery. So they were recommending taking me off the ventilator, stopping the antibiotics, and just letting me go. They protected Bond from the worst news that week, but he overheard that standing outside the room, and he came running down the hallway, pulled open my eyelid.
This is
My youngest son, Bond, who was 10 years old at the time, and he ran down the hallway, pulled open my eyelids, one eye over there, neither pupil working. Anybody in medicine knows that's a horrible picture. But at any rate, he was pleading with me, Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay. And I promise you, I didn't see him with my eyes, hear him with my ears. I was far too gone from this world, but it got through. And deep in that spiritual realm, I sensed his pleading with me, and I knew I had to be there for him. I didn't know how to do it, but I knew no matter what, this whole journey, because of my amnesia, I thought it could continue, it can cease, doesn't matter. But now everything did matter because there was another soul out there who needed me badly. And so it was imperative to come back to this world. And somehow my higher soul managed it. And, within hours, I was fighting the ventilator. And they pulled out the breathing tube, and I said, thank you. Now, I was still in for a wild trip because for the next 36 hours, I was in and out of a paranoid delusional psychotic nightmare, something we call a ICU psychosis. But I knew it was delusory. And that was very different from the memories of what had happened deep in coma when there's a medical case report on my medical records that confirms just how badly ill I was. That medical case report came out in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, February 2018. And they make it clear that my brain was in no shape to have any dream or hallucination, much less this extraordinary set of visions I did have. And in fact, the backstory to that case report is when the authors were challenged by the scientific peer review editors of the journal. How do you explain this? It's unprecedented in the medical literature for somebody this sick from E. coli meningoencephalitis to make a full recovery. They said it's because he had a near-death experience. That's what allowed for this apparently miraculous healing. And that was good enough for the scientific review board editors to say, okay, well, we have a reason, let's publish this. And they knew of other cases of people who had profound near-death experiences, should have died, according to our tenets of modern medicine, and yet somehow had a miraculous recovery. So knowing of many of those cases, that's where all of us should put our attention. If that kind of spiritual journey can lead to such wholeness and healing, in our physical, mental, and emotional states, I think we should also pay more attention to the aspects of spiritual healing that are revealed by these kinds of journeys. So anyway, came back to the world. It was a struggle in the first few days, but language came back incredibly fast. All my memories of these relationships, because when I first woke up, I didn't even recognize my mother, my sisters, my sons at the bedside. I had no idea who these beings were. But literally within an hour or two, language was coming back and all these memories were flooding back. And in fact, I remember my youngest sister, Phyllis, said it was so bizarre when she got there that day, about 30 minutes after I woke up. She said I was sitting on the bed and looked like this little Buddha. And I would look at everybody around me, doctor, nurse, family, friend, and I'd look them in the eyes and I'd say, don't worry, all is well. And then I'd move to the next person. Don't worry. And she said it was so strange because all week they'd been worrying about me. And now here I was coming back from deep coma and near death and telling them there's nothing to worry about. All is well. In a nutshell, that's kind of what I went through 17 years ago.
That's an amazing story. Like I say, that's that sort of kaleidoscope of experiences on that journey, which was a long journey, right? Because I think
Yeah.
that you've written that when you were experiencing that, it seemed to you like a very long time, like many
Months or
weeks.
years. I mean, that's what I would have said if you'd asked me, in the first few days, "How long were you away?" Because I was just beginning to even put back the details of what my life was before that. Because when I first woke up in the ICU bed, all I knew was that extraordinary spiritual journey I'd just been on. I had no other memories of my life, and that all had to be reassembled as memories came back over the next 2 months. A lot of the personal stuff came back within the first week.
So then, as you mentioned a few minutes ago, that this then led you on to another journey to figure out what the heck happened to me. And when you
Right.
realize that, like, your brain was essentially dead, and so these explanations, your doctor, well, you had a hallucination, and you realized, hold it, no, that the brain has to be functioning to hallucinate, and my brain wasn't functioning. So that this doesn't add up, and
Yeah.
it led you on this amazing journey of discovering and looking into, for the first time in your life in a more serious way, what is consciousness?
Well,
Who
it
are we? And
absolutely has done that, and I think one important thing I wanna point out, just in reference to what you just said minutes ago about hallucinating in the brain, um, a set of scientific papers have really grabbed my attention over the last 13 years, and these are papers we discuss them in Living in a Mindful Universe, but it has to do with fMRI, that is functional functional magnetic resonance imaging, and something called magnetoencephalography, MEG. Those are both of the best and most powerful techniques we have for looking at every neuron in the brain and neuronal networks when we're doing something as human beings. And these papers take people who are under the influence of psilocybin, magic mushrooms. And what they've done that's so interesting is with both MEG and functional MRI, you find the brain is going dark. It's not people who are on those substances, and this applies not just to psilocybin, magic mushrooms, but also LSD, DMT. These are all serotonin 2A type psychedelic substances and the interesting thing is no neuron or neuronal node in the network is increasing in activity. They're all being suppressed. And so, whatever is going on in that situation of these wild phenomenal experiences is not being caused by any kind of activity in the brain, other than the fact the brain is getting out of the way. The default mode network, which is kind of our sitting, with your eyes closed, but being awake and just kind of self aware, that default mode network just dissolves under the influence of psilocybin. My point is the brain is not doing the work of creating consciousness. There's a lot of brain that's actually just inhibitory and just gets out of the way. And in fact, the science in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, is the very same science you will find discussed in Dan Brown's new thriller, Secret of Secrets. Every bit of it is there, except Dan Brown takes this inhibitory observation and he pretends that GABA explains it. GABA is an inhibitory transmitter. But the thing he's not acknowledging and recognizing is if all you're doing is suppressing information processing units in something like the brain, you're not going to allow for anything to rise up above that suppression. It's all coming from somewhere else, and that's kind of the spiritual nature of our existence. So in other words, nobody should be caught under an illusion that the brain is the ultimate producer of conscious awareness or is the repository of physical memories. We talk about that in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, how memories are not even stored in the brain. But we need to get rid of those old improper assumptions because the brain is more of a transceiver and it's very effective at allowing us to connect with other minds, other brains, and with the mind of the universe, and with kind of a much grander reality. So that's really the gift of this kind of discovery, and that's why meditation is so important. You don't have to wait for the scientific community to tell you all this. Scientific community is waking up to it all, but as individuals, we can use meditation, centering prayer, different modes of going within to start taking advantage of this bigger reality of the nature of our minds and of the mind of the universe, and bringing the life of our ideals into fruition.
just a little break from the program to mention a couple of things. Firstly, if you're enjoying this podcast, please like and subscribe. It really helps the algorithm to find more people who would enjoy these interviews. Also, if you're interested in spiritual growth, you might be interested in my series of spiritual books. As a spiritual author and a former band director, I use my little the band director trademark in these books because I use music as a metaphor for life and our journey of becoming a musician as a metaphor for our spiritual journey. There are 3 books in these series. The Band Director's Lessons About Life is a book of modern-day parables inspired by events from my teaching career. When you're working with kids, things naturally come up that we sometimes call teachable moments. Little events where you realize that there's a bigger lesson happening right now than the alternate F-sharp fingering on the clarinet that I was trying to teach. I started writing some of these little stories down and turning them into modern-day parables. So, the Band Director's Lessons About Life has 50 little parables. It's a bit like a Chicken Soup for the Soul book. Each parable is about 3 pages long. Each begins with a story that happened in school, and then there's a reflection section that draws a spiritual lesson out of the events of the story. That is, it explains what the spiritual metaphor means. The Band Director's Lessons About Life is easy to read, makes a great gift, and expresses many universal spiritual principles in an easy-to-understand way. If you want to go deeper in your spiritual growth, I've also published a study guide to accompany the Book of Parables. It turns the Band Director's Lessons About Life into a year-long course in spiritual development. You will spend a week on each of the 50 parables. There's a deeper teaching about the meaning of each parable, reflection and discussion questions, especially if you would like to use the study guide in a group setting, and a different meditation for each lesson. The 3rd book in the series is a little book titled The Band Director's Pocket Guide to Spiritual Growth. This little book explains a simple 3-step process for putting your spiritual growth into high gear. You can learn more about all these 3 books and my other books at my website, www.cominghomespirit.com. Because, after all of us are on a spiritual journey back home to God. So that's cominghomespirit.com. You can also go directly to my Shopify page at cominghomespirit.myshopify.com, where you can purchase my books directly from me. At the moment, I can only ship paperback books within the continental United States. So if you live in other countries, you will need to purchase my books through Amazon in your own country. If you're enjoying this podcast, I really think you'll enjoy my Band Director series of books as well. Now, back to the program. Absolutely, that's great. Certainly in my book that should be available by the time this podcast interview is available, is it's actually a study guide that goes along with my Book of Parables. It essentially turns the Book of Parables into a year-long course in spiritual development. And I certainly emphasize the importance of meditation in that book and give a daily meditation. So even though I've always been lousy at meditating, I've been trying since I was a teenager, and I'm still lousy at it, but I keep trying. I keep
Well,
working.
if the problem is quieting that little monkey mind voice,
Oh, yes.
I think I might have an answer for you because I had the same trouble. And after my coma, I ended up in the first 2 years, I read about 150 books, lots of books on spiritual traditions, East and West, but also books on quantum physics, kind of the more advanced concepts of neuroscience and philosophy of mind. And then I realized the only way to really figure this out is to become an excellent explorer of your consciousness, a psychonaut. And that's what I had to do. And at the time, I read an article in Scientific American. It's called Auditory Beats to the Brain. It was written by Gerald Oster in the early 70s. And that article did a world of good for me because it discussed this finding by a Prussian physicist in the 1800s who found his name was Wilhelm Heinrich Dove. He found that if you put a pure tone in one ear, and for example, we'll say 100 hertz in one ear, 100 cycles per second, and a slightly different tone in the other ear, so 104 hertz in this ear. So a 4 hertz difference between the two. And there's a circuit in your brain that'll take that 4 hertz difference and turn it into 4 cycles per second kind of wavering sound, a very wah, 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 that kind of thing is what you sense. And yet that is not an actual sound anywhere. It's being created by the collision of these information waves in your lower brainstem. And I think that's one of the reasons it's so powerful at helping. I like the analogy that Michael Singer uses in his book, The Untethered Soul. He calls a voice in your head your annoying roommate. And that is absolutely the best way to look at it. That is not your consciousness. Your consciousness is an awareness of that voice, but that's more of your ego voice, and it's more of a parlor trick that can fool you more than anything. So meditation, centering prayer are ways to move beyond that voice in the head, the little ego voice. And the ego voice is the one that's sitting there if you're trying to meditate and saying, you're doing this all wrong. You can't do it. There's nothing to meditation. It's all woo-woo nonsense. Get out of here. That's that ego voice that is so toxic. And so it goes into timeout. And the effective technique I found is just to listen to binaural beats, brainwave entrainment. And specifically, what I use is Sacred Acoustics, sacredacoustics.com. But full disclosure here, Sacred Acoustics is a company that was co founded by my wife. She's also the co author of that book, Living in a Mindful Universe. And we talk a lot in that book about using meditation and sacred acoustics in particular. But for me, I'm an avid user. I've meditated an hour to a day. I've been doing that the last 12 or 13 years. Found it to be incredibly useful at getting me into a hypnagogic state between awake and asleep, where I can use a little ego voice as I go into a meditation to state a request, an intention, ask a question, what have you. But then that ego voice easily goes into timeout when I'm listening to those sacred acoustics tones. So if that has been your problem in meditation, is a monkey mind voice that won't go away, I highly recommend you start using Sacred Acoustics. And in fact, I can tell you that there is one sound file at sacredacoustics.com, and it's called the Whole Mind Bundle. It's a set of different frequencies. And that Whole Mind Bundle was actually used in a pilot study by Dr. Anna Yusum, a busy psychiatrist in New York. And she wrote up this pilot study in the peer-reviewed Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases. And that was in, I think, January or February of 2020. And what she found was that listening to Sacred Acoustics, specifically the Whole Mind Bundle, over 2 weeks gave her patients a 26% reduction in anxiety, compared to only a 7% reduction in people who spent those 2 weeks getting standard talk psychotherapy. So in other words, just listening to these tones was about 3 times as powerful at alleviating anxiety symptoms in a busy Manhattan practice. And in fact, when Karen heard that it was that good for anxiety, and this was at the very beginning of the pandemic, she did what a lot of good-hearted souls would do. She dropped the price to $19 and also gave a free option. She knew that given the economic cataclysm of a pandemic, that a lot of people would need relief of anxiety. So there's a free button that is still there. So for people who don't have the financial resources, you can go to sacredacoustics.com and still get Whole Mind Bundle that was proven to be so effective in this psychiatry study in New York City. And you can get it, at no cost at all. Of course, we appreciate that people who have the financial means would pay the $19 to help support everything else. But so far, Karen has continued that policy and just felt there are people who really need this. And so and there's a lot more to Sacred Acoustics than just the Whole Mind Bundle. And there's a lot more going on than just relief of anxiety. So people, like in our workshops, often connect with souls of departed loved ones. They find spiritual guides. They get into past life memories. There are many big features of being an advanced investigating soul that come to light when you learn to explore consciousness through meditation and centering prayer.
Wow, that's great. Thank you for sharing that with our audience, Eben. And I've known about Sacred Acoustics for many years, but I actually have not used any of the products there. So maybe your comments are the little push that I need to actually
Give it a
try them for
try. You might
myself
find
as
it
well.
very helpful. You
Yeah.
learn to ride those tones, and believe me, it's very powerful stuff. It's basically causing this oscillation in the lower brainstem. And we know from hypnotic work, with the pendulum, EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, anything that causes powerful left-right oscillations in the lower brainstem can be very useful at getting us into an altered state of consciousness that can be healing and bring us into wholeness.
Okay, that's great. That's great. You mentioned Dan Brown. Some of our listeners might might remember that Dan Brown is the author of the
Da Vinci Code.
wildly controversial bestseller, the Da Vinci Code, right?
Right,
One of the most best-selling books of all time.
right.
And so, yeah, that's fascinating. I'll have to check out his new book.
Well, I actually met Dan Brown because we both went to the same high school. We both went
Really?
to Exeter. He was 10 years behind me. But anyway, I met his wife too, Blythe, and she's the one who does all the research. And I met them right around the time that Da Vinci Code came out, and gave them a copy of Proof of Heaven. And I don't know if any of that ever influenced him, but I must say, if you read Secret of Secrets, his newest book, you will find an absolute one-to-one mapping of the science that we discussed in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe. That's a nonfiction book, but all that science comes to light again in Dan Brown's Secret of Secrets. And he's making
I
the case for the one mind and for the interconnection and for the binding force of love. He's just doing it through a very good and wild fictional story.
Well, that's great. I think I'd find that fascinating as well. One of the ideas that I wanted to touch on with you, since you have addressed this in your own life and your thinking and your research so much, is I've said to those few people who are interested in listening, and I've written that I think in this century, and that perhaps it's already beginning, that we are going to have to completely re-examine the field of epistemology. And epistemology is simply that branch of philosophy that deals with the question, how do we know what we know? And this became a thing, I guess you could say, in the period known as the Enlightenment, the 17th century. And there were kind of two schools of thought that were at odds for quite a long time that eventually reconciled and said, well, I guess maybe we're both right. And so one is that the people said, well, all knowledge comes from experience, right? So you have to experience something and then you know it. And we experience things through our five senses, seeing, hearing, tasting, etc. A scientist then takes that to a more quantified level and, you know, uses measurement and all this kind of stuff to try to understand relationships between things in the material world. But then there was the other branch, and so was called by the Latin term posteriori, or posteriori, right?
Mhm.
After posterior, right? After the
Right,
fact, after the experience, we gain the knowledge.
right,
But there were also those philosophers who said, well, no, I mean, because like knowledge comes before experience, because in logic and in mathematics, no experience is necessary. For example, if in the simple statement in logic that if A is equal to B, A cannot be unequal to B. You don't need any reference to any specific things in the material world. You don't need any experience of the material world. This knowledge comes before. And actually, all of mathematics is that way. It's quite fascinating. I've had taken lots of mathematics courses, not that I remember much of it, but it's always been amazing to me how mathematics really is what's called a priori knowledge. It
uh
comes before any experience. And the fact that mathematics is so incredibly useful in understanding the material world is
right,
just seemed like a miracle. Like
right.
there's got to be a reason for that, because it just seems to not make any sense. So there's these two branches in epistemology, two types of knowledge, a priori and a posteriori knowledge.
Mhm.
And what I've kind of been trying to get the point across is I think that in science has come to disregard individual experience. So that's just anecdotal,
Right,
as if it doesn't mean anything. And, I have a degree in economics and is think in terms of economics. Well, I mean, all aggregated information is just a whole bunch of anecdotal information,
Right.
right? It's just you put together the growth. You say, "Oh, we're going to talk about gross national product." Well, that's just everybody's production, what everybody produced in the whole each individual person. You say, well, his is just anecdotal. Yeah, and
Right.
you add all the anecdotal ones together and you get an aggregate. And then so
Exactly.
so personal experience has kind of been disregarded in science in general. And I think we have to kind of open up a evaluation of epistemology to think, well, even though it's subjective, if oh, well, for example, your experience, right? You
Mhm.
had an experience that nobody else had. Nobody else can share that experience. So it's not as if we can aggregate a lot of them because it's something that's unique to you. It was only experienced by you and not by anybody else. But it's still experience. It is still a posteriori knowledge.
Mhm.
And somehow we have to work that into our understanding of epistemology and how we know what we know.
Right.
Your
Very,
thoughts,
very
comments on that,
yeah,
Evan?
you raised multiple, very interesting points, but I think I would start by saying, um, that I know in having to dive deep into quantum physics over the last 17 years because I knew that there were some big answers lurking there because of the way the brain and mind work together. And ran into Eugene Wigner. He was a renowned quantum physicist back in the 40s, 50s. But he wrote this paper called "The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics," where he made exactly that. And a big part of the discussion, among scientists, mathematicians at the time is mathematics discovered or invented? And I would say very strongly it's discovered. I believe, in kind
Yes.
of the Platonic world of ideals, and I think that's exactly what I got into in the core realm. But it is astonishing how, I mean, the way Einstein said it is the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. I mean, they're all kind of remarking on this kind of insane matching of mathematics to describe the workings of this world. I mean, why is that? Uh, and it brings up tremendous issues as you point out about posteriori versus a priori knowledge. And I would just say to me, it's fascinating that the world of knowledge seems to kind of lead the way of how this physical reality unfolds. That's why you have things like placebo effect and you have things like miraculous healing and near death experiences. Beyond any kind of physical medical explanation, is because our mind has tremendous power to kind of lead the way in the emergence of matter in all of its configurations that are possible, but that ultimately it's all coming from the mental. And of course, that's hard for many of us to get because we feel like, well, wait a minute, this whole physical world out here, it's you bang on it and it seems very solid. And yet the interesting thing is it's almost all empty space and just pure energy and not like the analogy we use in the book Proof of Heaven is every atom that makes up all this material stuff, those atoms are 99.99999% empty space. I mean, you basically have a nucleus that has all the mass, and it's in the middle of this electron cloud that makes up all the atom. And if you scaled them up, the nucleus would be the size of a gnat, and the atom would be the size of the Notre Dame Cathedral. So that gives you an idea of just how much empty space is in this solid appearing world around us. So, in other words, a lot of it is kind of a Maya, kind of an
Yes.
illusion. And you have to understand, okay, so it's an illusion, but it represents something. There's something real and solid to all this, but it's certainly not the solidity of the physical world because we know that's not solid. That's all just about completely empty space. So you just have to kind of rework the way you think about how things operate and our knowledge of it. And the other important thing to point out about quantum physics in the brain and mind is that everything that modern neuroscience would say the brain absolutely depends on to do its job of thinking and interacting with mind occurs in the form of ion channels and synaptic vesicles and particles that are atomic and subatomic in scale. They're all quantum particles. In quantum physics, is basically about acknowledging that there's a top-down causality that in many ways is more important than any kind of bottom-up causality. The bottom-up causality is what materialist scientists are looking for when they say that all the electrons, protons, quarks making up atoms and molecules and cells and et cetera, if we understand how all those little particles work, that'll explain this whole reality we experience. But that's not really true. From my perspective, there's a tremendous amount of top-down causal influence that, for example, George F.R. Ellis has written extensively about top-down causality in kind of modulating quantum systems. But I think, especially as we've discovered that quantum physics is alive and well in the warm, wet world of our brains in biology. For example, when I came through in my training in the 70s, 80s, we were told that quantum, entanglement and quantum superposition could only be demonstrated at extremely low temperatures, very near absolute zero. And yet what we found is no, that's not true. Quantum effects are right there at the heart of things like photosynthesis, right at the bottom of the food chain, very photons from the sun hitting a chloroplast in a plant. It uses electron tunneling to do the most efficient kind of generation of chemical and energy, in photosynthesis. The sense of smell in humans also involves electron tunneling in a quantum system. And to me, one of the most interesting is migration in birds. Birds have a way they can look at the Earth and they can see the Earth's magnetic field. They don't see it as a pole to pole field, but they see it as a pole to equator field because they can actually measure the lines of inclination which come out directly from the North Pole, but at the equator, they're tangential. And anything in between, the bird can discern to use for migration purposes. That's a quantum tunneling effect. So quantum physics is very much alive and well in the warm, wet biological world. And what I would argue, as did John C. Eccles, who won a Nobel Prize in neurophysiology back in 63, and others like Wilder Penfield, I would say that the brain is a filter. It's not quantum informed filter. So it utilizes this larger quantum field to influence what we get to experience. And that's where things like remote viewing and telepathy gain their power. You have a ability to go beyond just your simple sensory systems in your physical body and get information acquisition, across time and space. That's what remote viewing is all about. And it's been, in spite of what Wikipedia tries to tell you about remote viewing, Wikipedia is not very good for these kind of topics. But the reality is, it's been proven beyond any reasonable scientific doubt. In fact, in her address to the American Statistical Association in 2015, Dr. Jessica Utz, as the group president, talked about her study of 20 years of evidence in both remote viewing and precognition and said that they've been proven beyond any reasonable doubt to the scientific mind. And yet some scientists refuse to look at the data. It's like the bishops who refused to look through Galileo's telescope.
Yeah.
They didn't want to look because they knew the church didn't like what they would see. And
Yeah.
so they just refused to look. Likewise in this discussion.
But that's how isn't that how our minds work, right? As it was, what's his name? As it slips my mind, who wrote the famous book, The Structure of Scientific
Thomas
Revolutions.
Kuhn.
Thomas Kuhn, thank you very
Yeah,
much. Right? He said that people will reject evidence that doesn't fit with the current theory or doesn't fit with their paradigm or doesn't fit with their worldview. We see it all the time. It's not just in science, it's in everything.
right,
We know when little bits of evidence come up that cast a doubt on our current beliefs, shall we call them,
right,
right? We typically reject that, and we reject it for a long time. We typically reject it until the evidence becomes so overwhelming that
right,
it's no longer possible to simply ignore it.
right,
And yeah, we see that going on in the whole world in every different way with people's worldviews, and
right.
we see it in science and in everything. It's yeah,
I can give you that evidence for the afterlife if you go to bigelowinstitute.org. you'll find 29 scientific essays that prove beyond any reasonable doubt that the afterlife, and many of them discuss reincarnation, are absolutely real based on modern scientific evidence. So just go to bigelowinstitute.org and you'll quickly realize science has already proven the reality of the afterlife. Now we just have to understand more about how it all works. But of course, as individuals, we can start exploring that connection with souls of departed loved ones,
Yeah.
etc., right now through prayer
Yeah.
and meditation.
Yeah, right, exactly. Bigelowinstitute.com. That's great. .org, sorry. Bigelowinstitute.org. Yeah, and so that you mean science needs to kind of expand, come up with a new theoretical framework that
Right.
fits this in, right? It's what science always does. It evolves, right? It's an evolving understanding.
It,
And that's what, when Einstein upset the apple cart of physics over a century ago, right? He said,
right.
okay, well, we
Absolutely.
need to now incorporate, this is a larger vision of how we can incorporate new knowledge and explain little, bits of evidence that didn't quite fit with Newtonian physics.
Right.
And yeah,
That's where the magic lies.
but like you say, on an individual basis,
Right.
it's what we really care about is our own personal experience,
Exactly. And
right?
that's
It
what we can
doesn't matter
work
if
with.
science has come up with a better unified grand theory or not.
Yeah.
It really comes down to how we live our lives and how we should be living our lives.
Right. Well, the other point I'd like to make, just kind of, in closing up this line of discussion, you had mentioned a necessity to kind of reevaluate and analyze our epistemology. Well, I would also say that our concepts of ontology, kind of the nature of reality, need a big revision. And I say that because life reviews, if they're studied scientifically, and for example, there's a paper by Bruce Grayson that came out in the Journal of Near-Death Studies, and that was back in the autumn of 2021. He makes it very clear in I think it was just about 700 cases out of his database of NDEs, 700 life reviews. And interestingly, he said 37% of them involved their entire life. And you wonder, how can that be your whole life flashing before your eyes? Well, it can if you acknowledge that that realm is completely outside of Earth time and is, in an eternal realm. And so this is where I'm talking about maybe our views of ontology need a major upshift to accommodate all this. 47% of people in his 700 life reviews said the events were relived as if they're still going on, not just remembered. 26% stressed that the life review was from the perspective of all involved. I like to say we're sharing the dream of the one mind, and that's what life reviews show us. And we find that hurting another is hurting ourselves. And 84% of the life reviews in his study said that they were more real than lived experience memories. So really, this is just a huge kind of challenge to what we think of, because the typical materialist mind says, well, life reviews are kind of remembering events of your life, very vague and dreamlike. And no, that's not the case at all. It's a reliving from the perspective of all as if the events are still occurring. Those are all challenges to our views of ontology that, to me, need to be greatly refurbished to allow a full acceptance of what the world, the universe is showing it has the power to do in these life reviews.
Yeah, very good. And for the benefit of our listeners, and maybe also for me, because I've looked this up, I've talked about it, and I'm not sure I still completely wrap my mind around it, but can you give us a concise definition of the term ontology?
Well, ontology is the notion of what is, the stuff that exists. What do we know exists in this universe? Now, from a materialist perspective, ontology is pretty simple and straightforward. It's just the physical material world, and it's completely causally closed. Now, they run into trouble with that all the time. And in fact, conservation of energy requirements, et cetera, there's a lot of discussion around free will in the brain and all those chemical reactions, electron fluxes. And the hint I will give you is, as John C. Eccles showed in a book published in the late 1980s, there is no violation of conservation of energy laws because Heisenberg's uncertainty principle allows for about 30% of the fire-no fire decision of neurons to be within Heisenberg's uncertainty limit. So in other words, the causality is not completely explained by the situation of what we can identify as those subatomic particles in those ion channels doing what they're doing. There's too much kind of fuzziness to it because of the tight position localization of the ion or synaptic vesicle. That tight position leaves a very wide open momentum vector. So in other words, these top-down operational principles can allow for the final decision of fire, no fire in these. This is why mind has so much power over matter, is because of these top-down kind of influences of the entanglement field, I would put it.
That's fascinating, and possibly the topic for another hour-long discussion at another time.
We might have more to talk about. You're right. So sure, we can do that. Let's see how your audience responds to all this, but if they want more, maybe we can talk again in a few months, something like that.
Dr. Alexander, it's been an absolute joy and an honor, a privilege to have you on. Thank you so much for agreeing to come and be interviewed and share your experience, your wisdom, your knowledge, your insight, and your love. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Donald, for all you do for getting this out there, and I appreciate your inquisitive nature and curiosity. I must say I was very excited when I saw your list of questions. It showed you were really paying attention. So thanks for that. It made for a wonderful interview.
That's great. Awesome. God bless you. And to our audience, God bless all of you also.